The spark in the darkness. Lieutenant David Parker's patrol car idled quietly on the darkened stretch of highway just outside town. The silence of the evening was heavy, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. It was the kind of night that left him alone with his thoughts, a dangerous place for David lately. His decades on the force had shaped him into a man of routines and sharp instincts, but also someone burdened by the weight of countless decisions, good and bad. The radio crackled faintly in the background, its static a soft reminder of the ever-present connection to the world outside. David glanced at the dashboard clock. It was nearing midnight. The darkness felt thicker than usual, like a tangible thing pressing against the glass of his patrol car. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion settling in his bones. Yet he wasn't ready to call it a night. Something was keeping him here, tethered to this road. Years of service had left him wary. Every late-night car idling on a deserted stretch of road was a potential situation waiting to unfold. The stories he had heard, the crimes he had witnessed, had etched a deep skepticism into his psyche. He prided himself on being thorough, perhaps too thorough, in ensuring his town stayed quiet and orderly. That dedication had earned him respect among some of his peers and derision from others. As his thoughts wandered, headlights flashed up ahead, briefly illuminating the outline of a car parked awkwardly along the shoulder. David straightened in his seat, his pulse quickening. It was a black sedan, sleek but unremarkable, its tail end jutting slightly into the road. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. There was no reason for anyone to be out here at this hour, much less pulled over like that. Instinctively, his hand hovered over the radio mic. But he hesitated. Something about the scene felt off, but it didn't seem urgent enough to call in backup. He pulled up slowly, his cruiser's headlights casting a stark, almost interrogative beam onto the parked car. The driver's silhouette was visible through the back window, motionless, as if waiting. David turned on his flashing lights, their red and blue glow slicing through the darkness. He stepped out, the cool night air brushing against his face as he adjusted his utility belt. Approaching the driver's side window, David adopted his practiced demeanor, calm, commanding, but with an undercurrent of suspicion. He tapped on the glass with the edge of his flashlight, the sound sharp and deliberate. The window lowered smoothly, revealing a man in his mid-30s, with sharp features and a calm expression. He was clean-shaven, wearing a pressed dress shirt with the top button undone, exuding a quiet confidence that immediately put David on edge. "Evening, officer," the man said, his voice steady. His tone wasn't deferential, but it wasn't disrespectful either. It was neutral, a balance David rarely encountered. "License and registration," David said curtly, keeping his tone clipped. His eyes scanned the interior of the car as the man reached into the glove compartment. The movement was deliberate, slow enough to assure David he wasn't reaching for anything dangerous. Still, David's hand hovered near his holster out of habit. The man handed over the documents, his gaze meeting David's without a hint of hesitation. His name was Marcus King, and his license listed an address just a few miles down the road. Local, apparently. Yet something about him didn't sit right with David. It wasn't anything the man had done. It was his calmness, his lack of nervousness. Most people, innocent or not, showed some level of anxiety during a traffic stop, but Marcus seemed almost prepared. "What are you doing out here this late?" David asked, flipping through the documents with practiced efficiency. Marcus leaned back slightly, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. "I was on my way home. Pulled over to take a call. Thought it'd be safer than talking while driving." David's eyes narrowed. The answer was reasonable, but the delivery, calm, almost disarming, irritated him. He wasn't used to being met with this kind of composure, especially not at this hour on this stretch of road. "Home, huh?" David said, his tone laced with skepticism. "People don't usually stop out here to take calls. You expecting me to believe that?" Marcus's expression didn't change. "You can believe whatever you like, officer. it doesn't change the truth." The response, delivered without a hint of arrogance, made David bristle. He leaned in slightly, his posture becoming more assertive. "You know, most people in this town don't take too kindly to strangers hanging around late at night. Makes folks nervous." "I understand," Marcus replied evenly. "But I live just a few minutes from here. If there's a problem, let me know." David felt a flicker of irritation. The man wasn't being confrontational, but his unwavering calmness felt like a challenge. David had dealt with his fair share of defiant individuals over the years, but this wasn't defiance. It was something else entirely. Something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "Step out of the car," David said suddenly, the words coming out sharper than he intended. He saw Marcus's jaw tighten for a split second before the man complied, opening the door and stepping out with a deliberate, measured movement. Standing outside the car, Marcus was slightly taller than David had expected, his posture relaxed but not dismissive. He met David's gaze directly, his expression unreadable. David felt a pang of unease, his years of training telling him there was more to this man than met the eye. But he couldn't back down now. He had to maintain control of the situation, to assert his authority. Yet, as he stood there, face to face with Marcus, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that he might be misjudging this man. Before David could say anything else, his radio crackled to life. It was dispatch, calling him in for a routine update. He ignored it, his attention fixed on Marcus. The air between them was heavy with unspoken tension, a silent battle of wills. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "Officer, if I may." David cut him off, his voice cold. "No, you may not. I don't know who you think you are, but you're not in control here." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "I never said I was." The words hung in the air, their simplicity cutting through the tension like a blade. David felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Doubt, maybe. But he pushed it aside. He was the one with the badge, the authority. He couldn't afford to let this man get under his skin. As the minutes stretched on, David realized that this wasn't going to be a routine stop. There was something about Marcus, something that felt off. But whether it was a threat or something else entirely, he couldn't yet say. For now, he would keep his guard up and his doubts buried deep. What David didn't know was that this encounter would set off a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his job, his beliefs, and himself. Tonight was only the beginning. Shadows in the light. The moon hummed low in the sky, veiled by a layer of thin clouds, casting an eerie glow over the rural highway. As Lieutenant David Parker stood there, staring into the unsettling calm of Marcus King's eyes, he felt the weight of an unexplainable tension pressing down on him. It wasn't the kind of tension he'd felt in countless confrontations before. No, this was something deeper, something that gnawed at the foundation of his carefully constructed world. "Step to the back of the vehicle," David ordered, his voice steady, but carrying an edge sharpened by years of authority. Marcus complied without protest, his movements deliberate. David followed, keeping a safe distance but close enough to assert dominance. He couldn't shake the feeling that this man's presence was different, though he couldn't yet articulate why. Marcus leaned lightly against the trunk of his car, crossing his arms, but keeping his posture open. "Look, officer, I don't mean to cause you any trouble," he began, his voice calm but not submissive. "If there's an issue, I'd like to resolve it quickly. It's been a long day." David tilted his head, studying Marcus like a puzzle he couldn't solve. His gut told him that Marcus wasn't just any passerby. The man's demeanor, the measured tone, the calm gaze, spoke of someone used to navigating tense situations. Most people would be nervous, stumbling over their words, but Marcus seemed almost comfortable. That in itself set David on edge. "Long day doing what?" David asked, his tone pointed. "Not a lot of jobs require you to be driving through the middle of nowhere at midnight." Marcus smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried no humor, but also no malice. "I'm a consultant," he said simply. Helps to be flexible with hours. Consultant, David repeated, skepticism lacing his words. What kind of consultant? Marcus shrugged lightly. I work with organizations to address systemic issues, help them find solutions to complicated problems. David raised an eyebrow. That's vague. Marcus met his gaze without flinching. It's complicated work. David leaned in slightly, letting the silence stretch between them. The wind picked up, rustling the nearby trees, as if nature itself had grown restless. Finally, David spoke, his voice low. You're not telling me everything. And you're not asking the right questions, Marcus replied evenly. David bristled. He wasn't used to being challenged, even indirectly. His instincts screamed at him to dig deeper, to unravel whatever Marcus was hiding. Yet something about Marcus's words felt like a warning, a subtle reminder that probing too far might reveal truths David wasn't ready to confront. The radio in David's cruiser crackled again, breaking the tension like glass shattering. He hesitated, glancing back toward the car, then to Marcus. Stay here, he ordered, his tone curt. Marcus gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. David strode back to the cruiser and grabbed the receiver. Parker here, he said, his voice clipped. The voice on the other end was familiar. Sergeant Harris, his shift supervisor. David, what's your status? Dispatch shows you've been stationary for a while. David glanced toward Marcus, who stood patiently by his car. Routine stop, he replied, keeping his voice neutral. Just checking on a vehicle parked on the shoulder. There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that hinted at more to come. Anything you need backup for? Harris asked, his tone laced with curiosity. No, David said quickly. It's under control. Good, Harris replied. But keep your eyes open. Got a report earlier about a suspicious vehicle in the area. Might be nothing, but you know how it is. David felt a pang of unease. What kind of suspicious? Dark sedan, out-of-state plates. Driver didn't stop for a local deputy a few miles over. Could be unrelated, but thought you should know. David glanced at Marcus's car, noting the in-state plates. Still, the coincidence was unsettling. Copy that, he said, his voice tight. I'll follow up if needed. Stay safe, David, Harris said before the line went dead. David replaced the receiver and leaned against the door of his cruiser for a moment, his mind racing. Marcus's car didn't match the description, but something about the timing nagged at him. He turned back toward the scene, his eyes narrowing as he studied Marcus from afar. As he approached, Marcus straightened slightly, as if sensing the shift in David's mood. Everything all right, officer? He asked. That depends, David replied. You're sure you've got nothing to hide? Marcus's gaze didn't waver. Everyone has something to hide, he said simply. The question is whether it matters. David clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. This man's calm, his unwillingness to flinch, felt like a challenge David didn't fully understand. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. You're not from around here, are you? I live nearby, Marcus replied. That's not what I asked. Marcus sighed softly, a sound that wasn't defeat but rather acknowledgement. You're right. I wasn't born here. Moved for work, but this is home now, if that's what you're getting at. David's mind worked furiously, trying to piece together the puzzle in front of him. Something about Marcus felt too smooth, too practiced. Yet there was no overt sign of wrongdoing. No stammering, no evasiveness. It was almost as if Marcus was accustomed to scrutiny, prepared for it in a way that unnerved David. What's your real story? David asked, his voice hardening. You're too calm for this to be just a routine stop. Marcus hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before replying. Maybe I've learned not to let fear dictate how I respond to authority. The words landed like a slap. David felt his face flush, his mind struggling to process the implications. Before he could respond, Marcus continued, his tone softer. Look, I get it. You're just doing your job. But we both know this isn't about a broken taillight or a suspicious stop. So why don't you tell me what's really on your mind? David stared at him, his thoughts tangled in a web of confusion, anger, and something he couldn't yet name. He had started this interaction, as he had so many others, with the assumption that his authority would go unchallenged, his instincts untested. But Marcus King was proving to be an anomaly, calm, composed, and entirely unshaken by the scrutiny. Finally, David stepped back, gesturing toward Marcus's car. "You can go," he said abruptly, his voice rough. "But stay out of trouble." Marcus's expression didn't change, though his eyes seemed to soften slightly. "Thanks, officer," he said quietly, before stepping back toward his car. As David watched him drive away, the weight of the encounter settled heavily on his shoulders. He didn't know what had just happened, but he knew it wasn't over. Something about Marcus King would stay with him, nagging at the edges of his mind like a riddle he couldn't solve. He climbed back into his cruiser, the radio silent now, the road stretching endlessly ahead. The quiet of the night returned, but David couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness held more secrets than he cared to admit. And somewhere, in the shadows of that night, a storm was brewing, one that would shake the foundation of everything David thought he knew. The unraveling. Lieutenant David Parker had tried to move past the encounter with Marcus King. He told himself it was just another late-night stop, nothing more than a blip in his routine. Yet days later, Marcus's calm, deliberate demeanor lingered in his mind like a splinter he couldn't dislodge. He replayed the conversation over and over, each word scraping against his ingrained instincts. It wasn't just what Marcus said, it was what he didn't say. David's gut told him there was more to Marcus than he let on, but for the first time in his career, he felt uncertain about his own judgment. That uncertainty gnawed at him, cracking the foundation of his beliefs. The precinct was buzzing when David arrived for his shift. Officers milled about, coffee cups in hand, voices overlapping in the familiar rhythm of controlled chaos. David's usual partner, Officer Rick Thompson, greeted him with a lazy wave from his desk. "Morning, Parker," Rick said, leaning back in his chair. "You look like you've seen a ghost." David forced a smirk, shrugging off the comment. "Rough night, that's all." Rick raised an eyebrow. "You and every cop in this place. Anything interesting happen on patrol?" David hesitated, unsure why he didn't want to bring up Marcus. He shook his head. "Just the usual." Rick nodded, accepting the answer without pressing further. "Well, keep an eye out tonight. Word is there's been some strange activity around town. Could be nothing, but you know how it goes." "Yeah," David said, his mind already elsewhere. As he settled into his desk, his gaze drifted to a bulletin board cluttered with pinned papers and photos. Among the clippings was a notice about an ongoing investigation into local corruption. Whispers of illegal deals, missing evidence, and officers taking bribes. David had dismissed the rumors when they first surfaced, confident that his precinct was above such scandals. But now, with Marcus's cryptic words echoing in his mind, he wasn't so sure. That evening, as David cruised through the dimly lit streets of his town, his thoughts kept circling back to Marcus. Something about the man's composure and his cryptic responses tugged at him. Against his better judgment, David decided to dig a little deeper. Pulling over in a quiet spot, he reached for his laptop and accessed the department's database. Typing in Marcus King's name, he waited as the system churned through its records. A file appeared, but it was thinner than David expected. Marcus was listed as a resident of the town for the past 3 years, his occupation vaguely described as a consultant. There were no red flags, no criminal history, nothing that suggested he was anything more than what he claimed. But then David noticed something odd. Marcus had no prior address listed, nothing before he moved to town. That alone wasn't damning, but it was unusual. Most people had a traceable history, a paper trail that connected them to jobs, family, or other cities. Marcus's file was clean, too clean. David leaned back in his seat, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. He couldn't explain why, but the lack of information made him uneasy. It was as if Marcus had appeared out of nowhere, stepping into the town's quiet rhythm like a ghost. Later that night, as David returned to the precinct, he was greeted by an unfamiliar car in the parking lot. A sleek black SUV with government plates. His stomach tightened as he parked and made his way inside. The atmosphere in the precinct was tense, the usual hum of activity replaced by hushed conversations and furtive glances. At the center of the room stood Marcus King, flanked by two men in dark suits. His presence was commanding but not overbearing, his posture relaxed yet purposeful. David froze in the doorway, his mind racing. What was Marcus doing here? And why was he with what appeared to be federal agents? Before David could gather his thoughts, Marcus's gaze met his. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and David felt the same unsettling calm he had experienced during their roadside encounter. Then Marcus turned to the men beside him, speaking in low tones. Sergeant Harris approached David, his expression a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Parker, you know that guy." David hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I ran into him a few nights ago during a traffic stop. Claimed he was just passing through." "Well, he's not just passing through anymore," Harris said, lowering his voice. "He's with the FBI. Says he's been investigating corruption in this precinct for months." David's heart dropped. "The FBI?" he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. Harris nodded grimly. "They're looking into some of our own. Ramirez, Collins, and a few others. Claims there's a network of dirty cops right under our noses." The words hit David like a gut punch. Ramirez and Collins. He had worked with them for years, trusted them. The idea that they could be involved in something so sinister felt like a betrayal. But even as doubt crept in, a small voice in his mind whispered that he had seen signs, moments that hadn't added up, conversations that had felt off. Harris glanced toward Marcus, then back at David. "Be careful around him. Something about this feels bigger than he's letting on." As the night wore on, David found himself alone in the precinct's break room, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything he thought he knew was beginning to unravel. The notion that corruption had infiltrated his department wasn't just shocking, it was personal. These were people he had trusted, shared shifts with, and even called friends. Footsteps echoed down the hall, and moments later, Marcus stepped into the room. He moved with a quiet confidence, his presence filling the space without effort. He didn't speak immediately, letting the silence settle between them. "You look troubled," Marcus said finally, his tone neutral. David shot him a wary glance. "You think I wouldn't be? You just walked into my precinct and dropped a bombshell." Marcus nodded, leaning casually against the counter. "I understand. This kind of thing shakes people to their core. But sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is to expose it." David's jaw tightened. "You're accusing men I've worked with for years. Men I trust. And that's exactly why this corruption was able to thrive," Marcus replied. "Because trust can be a weapon when it's misused." David stared into his coffee, his thoughts a tangled mess. He wanted to argue, to push back against Marcus's calm certainty. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the doubts that had been simmering in his mind for months. Marcus's voice softened. "I know this isn't easy, but ask yourself, have you ever seen something that didn't sit right? Something you ignored because it was easier to look the other way?" David didn't answer. He didn't have to. The memories came unbidden. Ramirez's sudden wealth, Collins's frequent absences, and the odd disappearances of evidence in key cases. He had brushed those moments aside, telling himself they were coincidences, not worth dwelling on. But now, with Marcus standing in front of him, those excuses felt hollow. "Why are you telling me this?" David asked finally, his voice rough. "Why involve me?" Marcus's gaze was steady. "Because you're not like them. You care about this town, about the badge you wear, And because I need someone on the inside I can trust. David let out a bitter laugh. Trust? You don't even know me. I know enough, Marcus said simply. You stopped me on that road because you thought something was wrong. You followed your instincts. And now I'm asking you to do it again. The weight of Marcus's words settled over David like a heavy blanket. He wanted to push back, to reject the idea that his department could be rotten at its core. But he also knew that ignoring the truth wouldn't make it go away. What happens if I say no? David asked, his voice low. Marcus didn't hesitate. Then I do what I came here to do. But if you say yes, you have a chance to make things right. David looked up, meeting Marcus's gaze. For the first time, he saw not just calm, but a flicker of understanding, of someone who had faced these battles before and come out scared but resolute. After a long moment, David nodded. All right, he said quietly. I'm in. And with those words, David stepped onto a path that would challenge everything he believed about himself, his colleagues, and the very meaning of justice, the depths of deception. The days following David Parker's reluctant agreement to work with Marcus King were some of the most unsettling of his career. He had always prided himself on being a steady hand in the chaos of law enforcement, a pillar of stability. But now, the ground beneath him felt unsteady, as if his entire world were tilting. He couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that he was being pulled into something far larger and far more dangerous than he had anticipated. The idea that members of his precinct, people he had trusted for years, could be involved in corruption was like a splinter in his mind. It hurt to think about, but ignoring it would only make it worse. It started with small things. Marcus had asked David to observe, to pay attention to details that might have seemed innocuous before, but now carried a different weight. David began noticing patterns. Conversations that abruptly stopped when he entered a room, officers whispering in corners, and subtle changes in body language when certain topics came up. Ramirez, once a boisterous and approachable colleague, now seemed guarded. He avoided eye contact, his interactions with David clipped and transactional. Collins, on the other hand, had become increasingly erratic. He spent more time outside the precinct than in it, his absences often unexplained. One evening, David sat in his patrol car, parked discreetly outside a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town. Marcus had tipped him off about a meeting happening there, a gathering of some of the officers suspected of being part of the corruption network. David felt a twinge of guilt as he sat in the shadows, watching his colleagues enter the building one by one. These were men he had once considered friends, men he had laughed with over bad coffee and long shifts. As the hours passed, David's unease grew. He couldn't hear what was being said inside, but the secrecy surrounding the meeting was telling enough. When the officers finally emerged, their expressions were grim, their movements hurried. David snapped a few photos with his phone, his hands trembling slightly. This was the first tangible evidence he had gathered, and it felt like crossing a line he could never uncross. The following day, Marcus reviewed the photos with a sharp eye, his expression unreadable. They sat in the back corner of a quiet diner, the clinking of silverware and murmured conversations providing a thin veil of privacy. "This is good," Marcus said finally, sliding the phone back to David. "It corroborates what we've already uncovered." David leaned forward, his voice low. "What exactly have you uncovered?" Marcus hesitated, then pulled out a slim folder from his bag. He opened it, revealing a series of documents: bank statements, surveillance photos, and transcripts of phone calls. David's eyes widened as he scanned the pages. The evidence was damning. "It's a network," Marcus explained, his tone steady. "Officers like Ramirez and Collins are just the middlemen. There are people higher up, both in the precinct and outside of it, pulling the strings. Bribery, extortion, evidence tampering. It's all here." David felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "And you think this goes all the way up the chain of command?" Marcus nodded. "It always does. Corruption like this doesn't thrive without protection from above. David leaned back in his seat, his mind reeling. He had suspected something was wrong, but seeing the evidence laid out so plainly made it real in a way he wasn't prepared for. These weren't just small-time infractions. This was systemic corruption, a cancer that had spread through the department he had dedicated his life to. As the days turned into weeks, David's double life began to take its toll. Every interaction with Ramirez and Collins felt like walking a tightrope, balancing between suspicion and betrayal. He couldn't let on that he was working with Marcus, but the strain of pretending everything was normal was wearing him down. At home, things weren't much better. Sarah, his wife, had noticed the change in him. She didn't ask directly, but her worried glances and tentative questions made it clear she knew something was wrong. David wanted to tell her everything, to unburden himself of the weight he was carrying, but he couldn't. Not yet. Then there was Ryan, his 7-year-old son, who idolized him. Ryan would sit at the dinner table, asking David about his day with wide-eyed curiosity, oblivious to the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. David felt a pang of guilt every time he dodged Ryan's questions, offering vague answers that felt like lies. One evening, as David was going over case files at his desk, Sergeant Harris approached him. Harris was one of the few people David still trusted, a steady presence in the precinct who had always seemed above the petty politics that plagued law enforcement. "Parker," Harris said, leaning against the edge of David's desk. "Got a minute?" David looked up, nodding. "What's up?" Harris hesitated, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "You've been acting different lately. More tense. Is there something going on I should know about?" David froze, his mind scrambling for a response. "Just the usual stress," he said finally. "Nothing I can't handle." Harris didn't look convinced. "If something's bothering you, you can tell me. We've got each other's backs, right?" David forced a smile. "Of course." Harris studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "All right. Just remember, if you need to talk, I'm here." As Harris walked away, David felt a surge of guilt. He wanted to trust Harris, to believe that he could confide in him without jeopardizing the investigation. But Marcus's warning echoed in his mind. Trust is a weapon when it's misused. The breakthrough came late one night when Marcus called David, his voice urgent. "We've got a lead," he said. "Ramirez is meeting with someone tonight. We think it's one of the higher-ups." "Where?" David asked, already reaching for his keys. "An old warehouse near the docks," Marcus replied. "I'll meet you there." David arrived first, parking his cruiser a few blocks away and approaching on foot. The warehouse was dilapidated, its windows boarded up, and its exterior covered in graffiti. He crouched behind a stack of rusted metal crates, his heart pounding as he watched Ramirez pull up in an unmarked car. Moments later, another car arrived. A man stepped out, his face partially obscured by the shadows. David squinted, trying to make out the figure. When the man stepped into the light, David's breath caught in his throat. It was Chief Daniels. David felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. The chief was the face of the department, a man who had always preached integrity and justice. To see him here, meeting with Ramirez under the cover of darkness, was almost too much to process. Marcus appeared beside David, his movements silent. He placed a hand on David's shoulder, a steadying gesture. "Now you see," Marcus said quietly. David nodded, his jaw clenched. He wanted to rush in, to confront them, but Marcus held him back. "We need more than this," Marcus said. "We need to catch them in the act." As they watched, Ramirez handed the chief a thick envelope. Daniels opened it, flipping through what looked like stacks of cash. David's stomach churned. The chief said something to Ramirez, his expression cold and calculating, before both men returned to their cars and drove away. Back in Marcus's car, the tension was palpable. "We have them," Marcus said. "This is enough to push for warrants." David stared out the window, his hands trembling. "The chief," he muttered. I can't believe it's the chief. Marcus placed a hand on David's shoulder. Corruption doesn't discriminate, David. It can infect anyone, no matter how high up they are. David nodded slowly, the weight of the night settling over him. He knew the road ahead would be treacherous, that exposing the chief would upend everything he thought he knew about his career, his colleagues, and himself. But he also knew he couldn't turn back now. For the first time in weeks, David felt a flicker of clarity. He wasn't just fighting for justice. He was fighting for the soul of his department, for his family, and for the man he wanted to be. The point of no return. The events at the warehouse replayed in David Parker's mind like a broken record, each detail sharper and more damning than the last. Chief Daniels, his boss, his leader, the man who had symbolized authority and integrity, was at the heart of the corruption that had rotted their department from within. The realization left David feeling hollow, as though a piece of his identity had been stripped away. Yet there was no time to dwell on the betrayal. Marcus King had been clear. The next steps would determine everything. If they moved too soon, Daniels and his network would destroy the evidence and fortify their positions. If they waited too long, more damage could be done. The window of opportunity was narrow, and David was standing at the edge of it. The following morning, David arrived at the precinct, his movements deliberate, his face a mask of calm. The coffee station was buzzing with officers exchanging small talk, their laughter ringing hollow to David's ears. He spotted Ramirez across the room, leaning casually against his desk, chatting with Collins. They looked as they always had, ordinary men in uniforms. But now, David saw them for what they truly were, wolves in sheep's clothing. David forced himself to act natural as he made his way to his desk. He sat down, pulling out paperwork he didn't intend to complete, pretending to lose himself in the mundane tasks of the day. But his senses were heightened, every movement around him magnified. He noticed how Ramirez's eyes flicked toward him occasionally, how Collins seemed more nervous than usual, fidgeting with a pen that clattered against the desk. The weight of what David knew bore down on him. He was no longer just a lieutenant. He was a spy in his own precinct. Every conversation, every glance carried the risk of exposure. If Ramirez or Collins suspected him, they wouldn't hesitate to protect themselves, no matter the cost. That afternoon, David met Marcus at a nondescript safe house on the outskirts of town. The building was unremarkable, blending into the industrial district with its gray walls and chain-link fence. Inside, however, the air was charged with urgency. Marcus had set up a makeshift command center with maps, documents, and photos spread across a table. "We need to act," Marcus said, his voice firm. "The evidence we have is strong, but we need a final piece, something that ties everything together. Without it, Daniels will claim plausible deniability, and Ramirez and Collins will take the fall as scapegoats." David frowned, leaning over the table to examine the materials. "What kind of evidence are we talking about?" Marcus pointed to a red circle on the map. "There's a storage unit rented under a fake name, but we've traced the payments back to one of Daniels's known aliases. Our sources say it's where they've been keeping sensitive materials, bribe records, transaction logs, even tampered evidence." David felt his pulse quicken. "You're saying all the proof we need is in that storage unit?" Marcus nodded. "If we get inside and retrieve the documents, we can blow this operation wide open, but it won't be easy. The unit is monitored, and we can't risk tipping them off." David hesitated, the weight of the task pressing down on him. Breaking into the storage unit wasn't just risky. It was a direct violation of everything he had been trained to do. Yet the alternative, allowing the corruption to continue unchecked, was unthinkable. "All right," David said finally. "What's the plan?" The operation was set for the following night. Marcus had arranged for backup, a small team of FBI agents who would remain nearby in unmarked vehicles, ready to intervene if things went sideways. David's role was critical. His knowledge of the area and his ability to blend in would give them the element of surprise. As night fell, David found himself sitting in his car, parked a block away from the storage facility. The lot was dimly lit, with a single flickering street lamp casting long shadows. He could feel the weight of his badge against his chest, a stark reminder of the line he was about to cross. Marcus appeared beside the car, his movements quiet and efficient. He leaned down to the window. "Ready?" David nodded, his throat dry. "As ready as I'll ever be." The two men moved toward the facility, their footsteps silent against the pavement. Marcus had secured a code to access the main gate, which slid open with a low groan. Inside, rows of identical storage units stretched out before them. They reached the backup vehicle just as the FBI agents emerged, their presence a sudden and overwhelming show of force. Ramirez and Collins froze, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons, but the agents moved faster, drawing their guns and ordering them to the ground. David watched as his former colleagues were handcuffed, their faces twisted in shock and anger. The betrayal in Ramirez's eyes was like a knife to David's gut, but he knew there was no turning back. Back at the safe house, Marcus and his team began cataloging the evidence. David sat off to the side, his hands trembling as he tried to process everything that had happened. The documents they had retrieved were more than enough to implicate Daniels, Ramirez, Collins, and several others. The operation had been a success, but the cost felt immeasurable. Marcus approached him, a faint smile on his face. "You did good, David." David looked up, his expression hollow. "I just took down my own department." "You helped save it," Marcus corrected. "And you've given this town a chance to heal." David nodded slowly, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope, a belief that justice, though painful, was still possible. The reckoning. The raid on the storage unit was only the beginning. What followed was a storm of revelations, arrests, and fallout that swept through the precinct, the town, and David Parker's own life like a hurricane. The evidence retrieved that night, combined with the testimonies gathered by Marcus King and his FBI team, proved to be a nail in the coffin for the corruption ring that had infiltrated the department. But the storm didn't bring relief. It brought chaos. And for David, it was the start of the hardest chapter of his life. The morning after Ramirez and Collins were arrested, David walked into the precinct, his badge feeling heavier than ever. The usual hum of activity was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. Officers sat at their desks, heads bowed, speaking in hushed tones. The weight of what had happened the night before hung in the air like a dark cloud. David's entrance drew glances, some curious, others hostile. He could feel the tension crackling around him, the unspoken accusations, the unasked questions. He made his way to his desk, his movements slow and deliberate. He knew his colleagues would see him differently now. He wasn't just another officer anymore. He was the man who had helped bring the department's secrets into the light. "Parker," a voice called. David turned to see Sergeant Harris approaching, his face drawn and tired. "The captain wants to see you." David nodded, rising from his chair. He had expected this. In the captain's office, the atmosphere was equally grim. Captain Morgan, a weathered man with deep lines etched into his face, gestured for David to sit. He looked at David for a long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "I don't think I need to tell you what kind of position we're in," Morgan began, his voice low. "The arrests last night have thrown this department into turmoil. Officers are scared, morale is in the gutter, and the public." He shook his head. "The public doesn't trust us anymore." David nodded, his throat dry. "I understand, Captain." Morgan leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "What I don't understand is why you didn't come to me. Why did I have to find out about this from the FBI? You've been my lieutenant for years, Parker. I trusted you." The words stung, but David forced himself to stay composed. "I didn't know who I could trust, Captain. When Marcus King approached me, I wasn't even sure if what he was saying was true. But as I started looking into it, I realized how deep this went. I couldn't risk tipping anyone off, not even you. Morgan's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly. I get it. Doesn't make it any easier, but I get it. The truth is, this department needed a reckoning. I just wish it hadn't come to this. David hesitated. What happens now? Morgan sighed, leaning back in his chair. Now, we rebuild. The FBI is conducting a full audit of the department. More arrests are likely, and some officers will be suspended pending investigation. It's going to take years to restore trust, both within these walls and in the community. David felt a pang of guilt. He had done what he believed was right, but the cost was higher than he had imagined. The fallout wasn't limited to the precinct. News of the corruption scandal spread like wildfire, dominating headlines and sparking outrage in the community. Town hall meetings became battlegrounds, with residents demanding accountability and reforms. Protesters gathered outside the precinct daily, their chants a constant reminder of the damage that had been done. David found himself at the center of it all. Some praised him for his role in exposing the corruption, calling him a hero. Others vilified him, accusing him of betraying his fellow officers. The duality of his position left him feeling isolated, caught between the gratitude of a community that needed answers and the resentment of colleagues who saw him as a traitor. At home, the strain was equally palpable. Sarah tried to be supportive, but the tension between them was undeniable. Their conversations often turned into arguments, Sarah questioning why David hadn't confided in her sooner, and David struggling to articulate the burden he had carried. Do you have any idea what it was like, not knowing what was going on with you? Sarah asked one night, her voice shaking with frustration. You shut me out, David. I'm your wife. I should have been there for you. I didn't want to put you in danger, David replied, his tone defensive. The less you knew, the safer you were. Sarah shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. You don't get to make that decision for me. We're supposed to be a team. David didn't have an answer. All he could do was hold her as she cried, wishing he could go back and do things differently. The only place David found solace was with Ryan. His son, still too young to fully understand the complexities of what was happening, continued to look up to him with unwavering admiration. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Ryan turned to him with a question that caught David off guard. Dad, are you in trouble? David blinked, taken aback. Why do you ask that, buddy? Because everyone at school is talking about the police, Ryan said, his small voice filled with concern. They said something bad happened. But you're still a good guy, right? David felt a lump form in his throat. He looked into his son's wide, innocent eyes and nodded. I'm trying to be, Ryan. Sometimes doing the right thing is hard, and not everyone will understand. But being a good guy means standing up for what's right, even when it's not easy. Ryan seemed to consider this, then leaned against David's side. I think you're a hero. The words brought tears to David's eyes. For all the chaos, the anger, and the uncertainty, knowing that his son believed in him gave him the strength to keep moving forward. As weeks turned into months, the department began to stabilize. The FBI's investigation resulted in more arrests, including Chief Daniels, whose trial became a media spectacle. The town slowly started to heal, though the scars of the scandal would remain for years to come. David found himself in a new role, not just as a lieutenant, but as a leader tasked with rebuilding trust within the department and the community. He worked closely with Marcus and other federal officials to implement reforms, focusing on transparency and accountability. It wasn't easy, and progress was slow, but it was progress nonetheless. One evening, as he and Marcus sat in the same diner where they had first planned their strategy, David reflected on the journey that had brought them here. Did you know it would be this hard? David asked, his voice tired but steady. Marcus gave a faint smile. Change is always hard, David, but the hardest battles are the ones worth fighting. David nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. He still had doubts, still carried the weight of the choices he had made. But for the first time in a long time, He felt a sense of purpose, a belief that he was on the right path. As he left the diner that night, the air crisp and filled with the sounds of a town beginning to find its footing again, David knew the road ahead would be long. But he also knew he wouldn't walk it alone. With his family by his side and the lessons he had learned guiding him, he was ready to face whatever came next. Because sometimes the hardest decisions aren't about choosing between right and wrong. They're about finding the courage to stand up when it matters most, and to keep standing, no matter the cost. Rebuilding the ruins. 6 months had passed since the night Lieutenant David Parker had helped expose the corruption that had rotted his department from the inside out. The town had begun to recover, but the scars left by the scandal were still raw. Trust, once taken for granted, was now a fragile thing, earned only through action and consistency. For David, every day was a fight, not just to restore faith in the badge he wore, but to repair the fractures in his own life. The precinct was quieter now. The FBI's investigation had thinned its ranks, and many of the officers who remained carried a heavy burden. The camaraderie that once defined the department was gone, replaced by an air of cautious professionalism. Some officers resented David for his role in bringing down their colleagues, while others looked to him for leadership in a time of uncertainty. David arrived at the precinct early one morning, the sky still tinged with the soft pinks and oranges of sunrise. He carried a steaming cup of coffee and a folder thick with proposals. The department's leadership had been completely restructured, with Captain Morgan stepping down, and a new captain, Rachel Ward, taking his place. Ward was a no-nonsense leader, a reformer brought in to clean house and rebuild the department from the ground up. David had quickly become one of her most trusted lieutenants. His willingness to challenge the status quo and his first-hand experience with the corruption scandal made him an invaluable ally in her efforts to reform the department. "Morning, Parker," Ward said as he entered her office. She was already at her desk, poring over reports. Her sharp eyes looked up, and she gestured for him to sit. "What have you got for me?" David handed her the folder. "Community engagement proposals," he said. "We got to start building relationships with the people we serve. Town hall meetings, ride-alongs, outreach programs, the works." Ward flipped through the pages, nodding thoughtfully. "This is good," she said. "The community needs to see us as allies, not enemies. And we need to give them a reason to trust us again." David leaned forward. "It's not just about trust. It's about transparency. If we want to prevent something like this from happening again, we have to change how we operate, top to bottom." Ward gave him a small smile. "You're starting to sound like a politician." David chuckled, though the weight of her words lingered. "I just want to make things right." One of the first initiatives David launched was a mentorship program aimed at connecting officers with local youth. The goal was simple: bridge the gap between the community and law enforcement by fostering positive relationships. David volunteered to mentor a group of teenagers himself, meeting them weekly at a community center. The program was met with mixed reactions at first. Some parents were hesitant, still wary of the police after the scandal. But slowly, as the weeks went by, the meetings became a space of mutual learning and understanding. David found himself listening more than he spoke, hearing stories from the kids about their experiences with law enforcement, both good and bad. One evening, as the session wrapped up, a boy named Jamal stayed behind. He was 15, quiet but observant, and had been skeptical of the program from the start. "Lieutenant Parker," Jamal began, his voice hesitant, "can I ask you something?" David nodded. "Of course." Jamal hesitated, then said, "Why do you even care? I mean, you're a cop. Why would you want to listen to kids like us?" David leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "Because I've made mistakes, Jamal. I've seen what happens when people like me stop listening, and I don't want to be part of the problem anymore." Jamal studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll give this a shot." For David, that moment felt like a small victory, a crack in the wall of distrust that had been built over years. At home, things were beginning to stabilize as well. Sarah had started to forgive David for shutting her out during the investigation, though the process was slow. They had started attending counseling sessions together, working to rebuild the partnership that had been strained by months of secrecy and stress. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Ryan play in the yard, Sarah turned to David. "I'm proud of you, you know," she said softly. David looked at her, surprised. "For what?" "For not giving up," she said. "For fighting to make things better, even when it felt like everything was falling apart." David reached for her hand, holding it tightly. "I couldn't have done it without you." Sarah smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "We've still got a long way to go." David nodded. "I know, but we'll get there." The biggest test of the department's new direction came when Chief Daniels' trial began. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as witness after witness testified about the corruption that had flourished under his watch. David was called to the stand, his testimony critical in linking Daniels to the evidence uncovered in the storage unit. As he recounted the events of the investigation, David felt the weight of every word. He knew his testimony would solidify his reputation as the man who had turned against his own, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. When the verdict finally came, guilty on all counts, David felt a surge of relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge of how much damage had been done. In the months that followed, the town began to change. The mentorship program expanded, new officers were hired under stricter vetting processes, and the department implemented body cameras and other measures to increase accountability. Slowly, the community's trust began to return. David became a familiar face at town hall meetings and community events. He spoke openly about the department's failures and the steps being taken to address them. His honesty resonated with people, and though not everyone forgave him for his role in the past, many came to respect his efforts to build a better future. One evening, as he prepared to leave a community meeting, an elderly woman approached him. She was small and frail, her eyes sharp with wisdom. "Lieutenant Parker," she said, her voice firm despite her age. "I used to think all cops were the same, that none of you cared about people like me." David felt a pang of guilt, but let her continue. "But I've been watching you," she said, "and I see the work you're doing. I see the changes you're trying to make. So thank you." David's throat tightened. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That means more than you know." As David walked back to his car that night, he thought about how far he had come. The road to redemption was long and fraught with challenges, but he had found a sense of purpose in the struggle. He wasn't the same man he had been a year ago. He was stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to make a difference. For the first time in a long time, David Parker felt at peace, and as he looked up at the night sky, the stars shining brightly above, he allowed himself to hope for his family, his department, and the town he had sworn to protect.